I am joined now by Yossi Klein Halevi, and boy, have I been looking forward to this for a long time. Dr. Michael Oren is a good friend of mine who I've entertained both here in the United States, and Michael has entertained me at the King David Hotel. And we always end up talking about Yossi along with Stephanie, his booker. So it is a great pleasure to welcome you to the Hugh Hewitt Show, Yossi. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks so much. You and not only do we have the same buddy in common, but I've been a long-time admirer of yours, and I'm so grateful, especially for your voice these last months. You're just one of the best friends that Israel and the Jewish people have, and just really, it's a pleasure and an honor to be with
That is the highest compliment I've ever received. So I thank you for that. Yossi, I was listening last night to the audiobook version of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which you recorded in your own voice and with your own particular diction. And it was a new layer of awareness about you. I did not know you had been part of the IDF in Gaza. I was unaware of your effort to fully immerse yourself in the Muslim world of Gaza and the West Bank. I didn't know any of that. I know you mostly through your weekly conversations with Daniil Hartman on For Heaven's Sake. So would you give people a little bio of Yossi Klein Halevi beginning in Brooklyn? So that, and it takes 29 years to get you to Israel, but I want people to know with whom I am speaking.
Yeah, I'm 70 now, just to give you some perspective. I grew up in a Holocaust survivor family in Brooklyn, and as a teenager, I gravitated to the far right of the Jewish community. I was a follower of Rabbi Meir Kahana, the very militant Jewish Defense League in the late 1960s, early 70s. And gradually I broke away from, I'd say, the mindset of Jewish self-ghettoization, which I certainly, in retrospect, understand the temptation of that. It was in some ways the most natural response of the second generation to the Holocaust. But I felt in the end that growing up in the United States in the most welcoming environment that Jews have ever experienced, with a sovereign Jewish state existing for the first time in 2,000 years, that it didn't make sense for me to be inhabiting my father's rage. My Jewish experience, in some ways, was the opposite of his. I grew up in the luckiest generation of Jews in history. To live between the American Jewish experience and have the option of becoming a citizen of the state of Israel really made my generation the most blessed in Jewish history. And my father's generation was the most cursed. And so that disparity became increasingly untenable for me. My father, in some sense, raised me to be a surrogate survivor, to be his psychological contemporary, and I couldn't hold that anymore. And so I've felt since then that the place that I need to hold is a very complicated Jewish place. On the one hand, my first commitment, my overriding commitment to the physical protection of Israel and the Jewish people. That, for me, is the legacy that I received personally as the son of a survivor, and collectively that my generation received from my father's generation. But at the same time, I also have a responsibility to be part of the world, to look for allies, and allies exist. My father taught me that the Jews are alone, we're friendless, and from my experience, I know that that's not true. So to fast forward to your question, I served in the IDF. I served in Gaza refugee camps in what we call the First Intifada, the period of the late 1980s, early 1990s, and of Palestinian riots. And really, we served in those years more in a policing role than a military role. My son has fought in Gaza. My son was in the tank corps, and he served in the first war against Hamas in 2009. And so Gaza is deeply a part of my family's makeup, our Israeli experience. And I've always felt since then that I have two responsibilities as an Israeli. And this is an extension of what I was saying to you earlier, about my two responsibilities as a Jew living after the Holocaust. The first responsibility was not to be naive about the intentions of the Palestinian leadership, of my enemies in the Arab and Muslim world. And my second responsibility, as someone who is part of a Jewish state that lives not in North America, but in the Middle East, to see if we have allies. And we know now that we do have allies in the Arab world. The Abraham Accords were really one of the greatest gifts to Israel in our history. And so my commitment has been not only to protect Israel physically, although, again, that's my first and overriding commitment, but at the same time to test the possibility of finding allies in the Arab world and within Palestinian society. Are there people on the other side who are prepared to accept the legitimacy of a Jewish majority state? And for me, that's the bottom line. It's not vague promises of peace. It's coming to terms with the Jewish people's return home. And so
Yossi, your second letter is kind of heartbreaking because you were an idealist who has come to grips from your hill in Jerusalem, looking at the wall with the necessity of that wall. And I say idealist, you did pretty much what I did in the 90s. I did a long series for PBS called Searching for God in America. And I interviewed imams, and I interviewed rabbis, and I interviewed the LDS elders, and I interviewed Roman Catholic monks, and I did that all for PBS. Because I thought, if you believe in a creator, if you see a design in creation, you got to be able to get along. But, that's not true. And I think your experience, it's like you got hit in the head with a hammer by the Second Intifada, and you communicate that so beautifully in Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. I wonder and that was written before 10/7. Are you even less optimistic now?
Well, it's not a question of optimism or pessimism. For me, it was always a being grounded in realism. And realism meant, first of all, understanding that the Palestinian national movement, in all of its factions, the PA, Fatah, never mind Hamas and Islamic Jihad, reject the legitimacy of the Jewish people's return home. And that was a given for me. And so I wasn't optimistic in the sense that peace is imminent, but I was hoping to find some people in Palestinian society with whom I could model a respectful conversation, even respectful disagreement. And Palestinians and Israelis, as you know, disagree about everything. We disagree about who's responsible for the Palestinian refugee crisis of 1948, who's responsible for the collapse of the Oslo peace process in the 90s. We disagree about what's happening in Gaza today, literally today. And so we disagree about everything. But I was looking for some people on the other side who are ready to enter into a conversation of mutual legitimacy of these two peoples that are stuck with each other in this little land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And I did find those people, and I included their responses to me in the paperback edition of Letters, which came out a year after the hardcover. And I have an epilogue there called Letters from Palestinians to their Israeli neighbor. And so that project really fulfilled what I hoped it would do, which is model what a conversation between religious people would sound like, a respectful disagreement about peace.
So Yossi, I want to set this up the right way. I want to ask the necessary question. Where were you on 10/7, and what impact did 10/7 have on you emotionally? I was broadcasting on 9/11, so my 9/11 day is all recorded and on air. I stayed on air for 8 hours, and the shock and the misery and the pain is all in that broadcast. I'm just wondering, what were you doing on 10/7, and what was the impact on you?
Well, 10/7 was a Jewish holiday. It was the holiday where we rejoice in the completion of reading the Torah in the synagogue, and it's a day where religious Jews don't listen to the news. But that day, I violated my restrictions, and all I could do was try to hunt any bit of evidence, and through the day, the horror began to become clear. Although the truth is, we're still sifting through the debris and finding new horror. And I think this is going to be a process that will take us through this generation. I don't think we're ever going to recover from October 7th. And you had asked me earlier how that affects. And I can tell you that I would not be able to write the letters book today. Not because I disagree with anything that I wrote there. I still believe in a two-state solution in principle as the best outcome for Israel. Whether it's practical or not, whether we have a partner we can trust, certainly that's not true for the foreseeable future. But I stand by what I wrote, but the reason that I wouldn't be able to write that today is more emotional than ideological. Writing that book required reaching out to the Palestinians and trying to listen and even empathize with their counter-narrative. I don't have that capacity today to empathize with the counter-narrative. I'm trying to keep my heart open to Palestinian suffering. I think that is my responsibility as a human being, as an Israeli, as a Jew, even as I support this war and believe that we have no choice but to see this war through and to destroy genocidal regime on our border, and not only Hamas. That extends to Hezbollah in the north and eventually to Iran. You've heard Michael Oren speak enough about Iran, and Michael and I, for years, worked together on promoting the idea that it's not enough to try to restrain Iran from reaching the nuclear threshold, which they now have done, but Israel needs to see its strategic goal as destroying this Iranian regime, which is committed to the destruction of Israel. And so on these issues, I'm very hawkish, and I don't see any contradiction between my absolute commitment to Israeli security and at the same time trying to reach out to the other side. But I don't have emotionally, after 9/11, after October 7th, I don't have the ability. I don't have the reach, the emotional reach to do that.
We're about the same age. I don't think we're ever going to see the lion lay down with the lamb, although I think we're going to see Saudi Arabia and Israel enter into a partnership. Yossi, by way of introduction to you, the most influential book I read about the Jews is this one, The Redemption of the Unwanted by Abram Sakar, who was the founding president of Brandeis. It's a wonderful book, and it really changed my whole understanding of the Holocaust, but I still didn't know anything about Zionism. And I was, like most average Americans, completely ignorant of Theodor Herzl and the Jewish state, which I've now listened to. I was ignorant of where Zionism came from. I now call myself, an American Zionist, even though I don't know if you think non-Jews can be Zionists. I think they can.
Oh, absolutely. Look, we're living in an era. We're living in an era where we have Jewish anti-Zionists in America and non-Jewish American Zionists. So.
All right, so my question to you is, I should say, the audience might call me out. my wife's grandfather was Jewish, and her family lost people at Auschwitz, but she's not Jewish. I'm not Jewish. My kids have some Jewish genes. I don't think they would qualify to make Aliyah. And Stephanie always tells me my Hebrew is the most atrocious she's ever heard in the world. But Yossi, what do you think your father is saying to you? I mean, what is he saying to you in your head right now? Is he saying to you, "See, I told you"?
My father, in his last years, he died quite young. And what I've noticed among survivors was they either died very young, or if they managed to get through their 50s and 60s, lived to their 90s. Now, my father was in the first category, but what I remember from his last years was a softening. And I remember one day we were watching the news together, and something about the Palestinians came up, and my father just said, almost to himself, he said, something has to be done about this. It can't go on like this forever. And I was very upset at him at the time. I said, are you softening? I didn't dare say that to him directly, but to myself, I said, are you getting soft on me now in your middle age? And I think my father would appreciate the complexity of Israel's dilemma. That on the one hand, we have no choice but to continue the occupation of another people because we have no peace partner. On the other hand, the deeper the more permanent the situation becomes, where we're ruling over a people that doesn't want to be part of our society and whom we don't want as part of Israel. The worse our predicament is going to become, both internally within Israel and our situation around the world. And so
I hope my audience goes out. I hope they go out and get letters to my Palestinian neighbor, because in letter 2, you review the facts of the offer that Ehud Barak made via Bill Clinton in his negotiations with Arafat. Gaza and the West Bank with a road connecting them, 98, I think, percent of the West Bank, the blowing up or the emptying out of hundreds of settlements. I mean, it was an amazing offer. And I didn't know any of that. And I just don't know how anyone can be an optimist until I've had Palestinian American law students. I've been teaching law since 1996. They're very reasonable. I know there are reasonable Palestinians out there. I just don't know if they don't get killed every time they put their head up.
Yeah. There is no national movement that I can think of anywhere that has rejected more offers of empowerment and statehood than the Palestinian national movement. Going back to the 1930s, the offer was never good enough. And so the map kept getting smaller and smaller. Settlements expanded. But I have no doubt that the primary responsibility here belongs to the Palestinian leadership. Now, I'm not absolving Israel of our share in this tragedy. We do have a share. But if there had been a credible peace partner on the other side, this would have been solved decades ago.
Yeah, but what we didn't see, Yossi, and maybe you disagree with this, what I didn't see is that fundamentalism would overtake Islam to the extent and depth that it has, and the search for Islamic renewal would distort itself into this ferocious anti-Semitic hatred of the Jewish state. It never made any sense to me. It still didn't make. When I listen to you and Daniil, I think you're both still coming to grips with the fact it doesn't make any sense, but it's horrific and we have to deal with that. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, Daniil and I approach this in different ways. Daniil comes from an American Jewish family that really was steeped in love of modernity and optimism. Daniil's father, Rabbi David Hartman, was one of the great Jewish philosophers of our time. He was my mentor and friend. And my father was not an optimist about the Jewish place in the world. And And what you hear on our podcast is the two of us trying to do this very complicated dance of unpacking the complexity of the challenges that Israel and the Jewish people are facing, to try to be as realistic as possible about the dangers we face, and at the same time to keep that possibility open of a different future. And that, to my mind, is embedded in Zionism. You know, you mentioned Theodor Herzl. There was no greater optimist about the Jewish future than Herzl. Read his book Alt Neuland, Old New Land.
Oh, I don't know that one. Okay.
Oh, it's extraordinary. It's a utopian vision of what the Jewish state would look like, and you read it. It bears no resemblance to the Jewish state today. Certainly not in terms of our relationship with the Palestinians. Although Herzl did predict this thriving Jewish success story, that is in the book, and so built into Zionism was two promises to the Jewish people. The first was return to the ancient homeland, and the second was a return to the international community, to the family of nations, if one could use that optimistic language. And Herzl and other Zionist leaders, including Jabotinsky on the right, including Menachem Begin, all believed that Zionism was not only a return to the land of Israel, it was also a return of the Jewish people out of the ghetto back into humanity. And so that for me is so much a part of what the promise of Zionism is that I'm not ready to give up on.
You know, Yossi, you've probably got a publisher and you don't need suggestions from me, but I would like to read Letters to My Grandchildren by Yossi Klein Halevi, because I predict, and I've been to Israel a grand total of 2 times, so I don't know much about Israel, but I've studied it.
Oh, wow.
I predict that your new generation is going to be pretty hardcore about peace with the Palestinians. And I listened to Haviv Rettig Gur, and I listened to the other people that Dan Senor interviews in Israel, and I hear a resolve, never again 10-7, not just never again Holocaust, but never again 10-7, and we're not going to put up with Iran. What do you think your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren's generation is going to be like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that never again has shifted to a Middle Eastern context, and what October 7th has done is create such a profound trauma in this generation that it is going to make an Israeli openness to even the possibility of peace much more difficult, and that's entirely understandable and natural. You mentioned Saudi Arabia earlier. I think that's the key here for the future of Israel's relations with the Arab world. And you know, we used to think in Israel, certainly in the 90s, and you may remember this, Hugh, that solving the Palestinian problem was key to Israel's acceptance in the Arab world and the Muslim world. And now I think that solving the Palestinian issue might be last. We might be making peace with large parts of the Arab and Muslim world before we can even begin to unpack the Palestinian dilemma. And maybe that's a prerequisite. Maybe the only way we can begin to solve this is in the context of a regional solution with the Saudis, with the Gulf states, with other Arab countries. But to answer your question...
Let's stay there for a moment. Because earlier we talked about Iran, and I'm going to refer to the Shia fundamentalists as opposed to Iran, because the people of Iran, as many of them as I have ever known, and I've known many, are vibrant and freedom-loving, and they hate this regime. They hate the IRGC. They hate everything about the Quds Force. They hate their regime, but the regime is very strong. I don't think anything happens between the Palestinians and Israel until the Iranian regime changes. Thus, I was underwhelmed by Israel's response to a direct attack on it by more than 300 missiles and bombs that were intended to kill a lot of Jews. I mean, and a lot of Palestinians. It was just a massive attack. What was your reaction to the Israeli reaction to that?
I oppose the very notion of retaliation. Retaliation does not belong in the lexicon of warfare. Retaliation is something you do when you're trying to restore equilibrium, when you're trying to restore quiet. We're at war with Iran. You don't retaliate against Iran. We need a long-term strategy to bring this regime down. And so I would have much preferred Israel to do nothing and instead to bide our time and to hit Iran in our, at our pleasure, at our timing. And so I think that we're going about this the wrong way, and I agree with you.
Well, I'm astonished that they thought, well, we'll signal to Iran that we have capabilities. Everyone knows Israel has capabilities Iran does not have, but it's not going to be that way for long. The hourglass is running out of time where Israel can confront Iran and maybe attack Iran before they have a nuclear response at their disposal, which Israel cannot afford. So do you think most Israelis agree with me on this?
I do, except that it's not in foremost in the minds of many Israelis. We're so preoccupied with what's happening on our borders, whether it's in the south with Hamas or the north with Hezbollah, that many Israelis are not looking at the wider picture. And this is really a strategic victory. I would say a historic victory of Iran to surround Israel with its allies and proxies. Iran is not thousands of kilometers away from Israel anymore. Iran is literally on our borders. And what I felt on October 8th was that we should leave Hamas aside and leave Hezbollah aside and go directly to Iran. We need to stop fighting Iran's proxies and go directly to the head of the snake. And I'm quoting former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who said exactly that. So, I think that we are evading the necessary and traumatic confrontation with Iran. I say traumatic because it will be the worst war that Israel has ever experienced. Certainly.
Well, I am reminded of the Battle of Midway. It took 6 months for the United States to recover from the shock of Pearl Harbor. And Midway, which was a close-run thing, was nevertheless the turning point in the war. We never know when the turning point in a war is coming, but we know only when it's over, when it came. I don't think we're even close to halfway through this war yet. By we, I mean the West. And I think right now, unusually, Yossi, I think Israel is the leader of the West because the United States is paralyzed politically, socially. We got to get to what's going on our campus. Do you understand Israel as the leader of the West at this point? And by the West, I mean, I don't support Israel because I'm a Christian. I don't support Israel because I'm a Jew. I support Israel because I'm a free Westerner. And they are a free Western society in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and they're the only one. I've got friends and allies who are among the Arab communities that have made peace with Israel, but there just aren't that many democratic. There are none other than Israel. And I think you guys are the leaders of the West right now. Do you think you are?
I think that it's been forced on us. It's not a job we have voluntarily assumed. But yes, I think that the West has refused to face the full implications of the war that we are now fighting. But for that reason, we need a different. Well, I'll say it straight in the most straightforward way I can. We need a new government because the government that presided over October 7th doesn't have the ability to keep Israel united. It has lost the trust of the Israeli people. And in order for us to fulfill that essential role of, first of all, protecting Israel, and secondly, of showing the West exactly what we're up against. We need a change of government.
You know, Yossi, it's a rule on my show. I never opine on what another country should do, but I do predict what will happen. And I know, for example, Britain's Tories are about to get wiped out at the next election for a variety of reasons. And I know that Netanyahu and Likud are going to get, at least Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to get tossed, no matter how long he postpones it. Maybe it's 3 years. Give me a vision of what the next government that's elected looks like.
We have two scenarios. One is basically the opposition coming back to power. And the opposition is a very broad coalition that begins with strongly right-wing parties like Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Our Home. If Naftali Bennett creates his own right-wing party, that would conceivably be part of the coalition. Moving to the center-right party of Benny Gantz, onto the center-left, soft-left party of Yair Lapid, back onto the left of Labor, and possibly a joint party between Labor and its farther-left party, Meretz. Now that is a coalition of national healing. And I personally hope that that's the coalition that comes to power. An alternative is a new right-wing party that would be headed by Bennett, maybe Yossi Cohen, the former head of the Mossad, and several other right-wing figures who are very strong on security, but are also keen on protecting Israel's democratic institutions as opposed to its current government. And I could see them leading a government and then inviting parties to their left, Benny Gantz, maybe Yair Lapid. I don't see Labor Meretz necessarily coming into that coalition. But now, so you have different configurations. The question really is what really the place of a post-Netanyahu Likud in that coalition. I personally hope that the current Likud stays out of power for at least one term and begins to transform itself back into the party that it once was under Menachem Begin and Shamir and Sharon. The Likud was a party that called itself a liberal nationalist party. Now that sounds like an oxymoron in American terms, but in Israeli terms, Menachem Begin and subsequent leaders of the Likud, including Netanyahu himself until this government, were firmly in favor of an independent Supreme Court, were firmly in favor of a free press, were firmly in favor of minority rights for Arab citizens. That is not the Likud today. The Likud today more closely resembles a far-right European party than it does the traditional Likud.
You know, I want to ask you about Begin, because he was one of my heroes, because I was in the Reagan administration. We inherited his great work with the Camp David Accords. And of course, he had the strength and the reputation to step forward. Dan Senor recommended me Daniel Gordis's book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, which I read. I didn't know anything about Begin. I didn't know he started in Russia. I didn't know he escaped. I didn't know what he thought about the British Mandate. I didn't know any of that stuff. I'm like most Americans. If it didn't happen in the last 25 years, I don't really remember it, and I don't know it. What do you think Begin would think about Likud today?
Well, his son, who followed in his footsteps and was a minister in Likud government, spoke at a rally against Netanyahu and said my father would be turning in his grave. And he said, this is the exact opposite of the Likud that my father envisioned and my father created. And I think that Menachem Begin would be horrified by what Netanyahu has done to the mainstream Israeli right. He'd be horrified by the fact that Netanyahu brought in the spiritual disciples of Rabbi Meir Kahana, far-right leader, who I once followed as a teenager in Brooklyn. And every time that Meir Kahana would speak at the Knesset, he was a Knesset member, in the 1980s. And every time that Meir Kahana would get up to the podium in the Knesset to speak, Yitzchak Shamir, who was the successor to Begin and was the prime minister when Kahana was in the Knesset, Shamir, who was a very hardline politician, would lead the entire Likud faction in protest out of the plenum. Now, Netanyahu brought the disciples of Meir Kahana into the government. Ben-Gvir, the minister of police, Menachem Begin wouldn't believe that a leader of the Likud would bring a disciple of Meir Kahana into the government to head the Israeli police.
Yeah, we've got to stop there, Yossi, because you've got to explain to an American audience. You and Daniil always do this and reference people and places and movements for which the average American has no frame of reference. I know about Kahane. Would you explain to my audience why Kahane is such a reprehensible figure in Israeli politics and his disciples, Ben-Gvir and the other one?
Meir Kahana was the first Israeli politician to bring in overt racism and hatred into Israeli politics. And he did so, and really compounding his offense, by invoking a kind of religious justification for racism. He created his own little denomination in Judaism that legitimized hatred of certainly of Arab Palestinians, but really hatred of the whole non-Jewish world. And Kahana was, to my mind, the antithesis of what Menachem Begin represented. And his disciples have indulged in violence. Ben-Gvir, the joke in Israel is that Ben-Gvir is the most qualified Israeli politician to head the police because no one knows the Israeli prison system from the inside better than he does.
Huh!
And so...
I didn't know that.
So, to corrupt Israeli democracy is one of the most precious miracles of the Jewish state. There's no other democracy in history that has been under such sustained security threat as Israel. From day one, we have never known a day of peace. No democracy has to deal with the security threat that we have to struggle with. And so one of the glories of the state of Israel, one of the gifts of the state of Israel to the world, whether the world acknowledges it or not, was creating this laboratory of democracy under extremity. That's how I understand Israeli democracy.
It's a stress test of democracy, absolutely. But would you explain one thing for me? I know you participated in the demonstration, because I listen to you and Daniil every week on For Heaven's Sake, which I recommend to my audience. And I know you were both opposed to the Supreme Court reform. Again, I don't take positions on other countries' laws, but Ambassador Oren has explained to me the system is broken. It does need a fix because they select themselves, which I can't believe. What were the demonstrators suggesting as an alternative? Because I never heard what the alternative was.
The alternative was reform within a broader context. You don't just empty the Supreme Court of any power, because in the Israeli system, unlike the American system, we have no other checks and balances except the power of the court. Because we're a parliamentary system, because we don't have a constitution, all power effectively resides with the prime minister. The only counterbalance to the prime minister's power is the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court has too much power, that's true. But if you're going to reduce the power of the court, as I believe should be done, you have to create a constitution. You have to create other checks and balances. You don't just empty out the court of its power without dealing with the other flaws in the system. That would have given Netanyahu and his fundamentally corrupt government. This is the most corrupt government we've ever had. And by corrupt, I mean literally corrupt. This is a government that has more convicted felons or people on trial for felony than any government in Israel's history. To give this group of politicians virtually unlimited power would have destroyed Israeli democracy.
Wow.
And so we were fighting to protect Israeli democracy and to create a situation where reforms could be possible. Now, the critics of the protest movement were right about this, which is that the protest movement was nowhere to be seen previously. And we should have been the ones all these years coming forward and saying, listen, here's a plan for fixing the system. But the way things work in Israel is that you get pushed to the edge of the abyss and then you pull back.
Well, what's going on right now? I sympathize greatly with the hostage families. There are Americans who are held hostage by Hamas as well, but I don't understand the demonstration. I mean, they don't have access to the intel. They don't know what the plan is. They don't know what the Israeli government, well, the war cabinet, which is pretty, I think Ron Dermer's really smart. I think Gantz is really smart. And I can't remember the other observers, but I think they're all really smart. Netanyahu's certainly experienced. What is this demonstration aimed to do? What do they want Israel to do?
Look, I don't agree with Netanyahu on many things. I do agree that these demonstrations are counterproductive. They only harden Hamas's position. The problem is that what the families who are leading these demonstrations are expressing is a profound sense of broken trust in Netanyahu. If we had another prime minister, Benny Gantz, for example, were prime minister, the head of the center-right party that is sitting in the war cabinet, if he were the prime minister, he would be able to have a conversation, a dialogue with the families and saying, listen, we're doing everything we can. You have to trust the government. Netanyahu can't say that because nobody trusts it. There was a poll taken a couple months ago asking Israelis, do you believe that Netanyahu places the interests of the country first or his own political interests? 60+% said his own interests. He has emptied out any possibility of a dialogue of trust.
But Yossi, one last question on this before I turn to campuses. Netanyahu won. And I mean, it's sort of like when Trump won in 2016, I was on the set at NBC. It was like a funeral, right? It was like a wake or just a terrible, terrible incident had happened. Instead of, oh, he won an election, there'll be another election down the road. Netanyahu won. Doesn't anyone say, well, he won, he put the coalition together, and you forced him, Benny Gantz, into taking in the far right because he wanted to be prime minister again. What do you say to that? That look, he won.
Yeah, what I say are several things. First of all, I'm not traditionally, I'm not a Netanyahu hater. I voted for him in the past. I deeply respected him. I appreciated the leading role he took in galvanizing parts of the West against Iran. I saw him as one of our most talented and effective leaders until this last government.
Oh,
now,
interesting.
When Netanyahu ran in the last election, he concealed his agenda about the court. That was not part of his platform. In fact, leading members of the Likud acknowledged that they had no idea that this was coming. And so that's first of all. Netanyahu ran on a platform that most of his voters did not most of his voters assumed they were voting for the old security-minded Netanyahu, not a Netanyahu who would centralize the assault on Israeli democratic institutions and prioritize that over security. The reason I say prioritize is because he was repeatedly warned over the last year of the consequences of continuing to pursue its anti-democratic agenda, which divided Israeli society to an extent that we were never divided before. He was warned by the security establishment, don't do this. You're sending a signal to our enemies that we're divided. We are going to be attacked. There were banner headlines in the Israeli press throughout the year leaking these warnings from the Israeli security establishment. So that brings me to the next point. Netanyahu was a legitimate leader until October 7th. He lost the mandate on October 7th. You can't preside over the worst defeat that Israel suffered in its entire history and act as if nothing happened. You can't only claim credit for when the army has a success and say, I'm the commander, and call a press conference. We rescued 3 hostages. And to take credit for that, yes, you're the commander-in-chief, you deserve credit for that, but you also deserve to take responsibility for October 7th. Golda Meir, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time of the Yom Kippur War, was forced to resign for what, in retrospect, was a far lesser offense than October 7th.
Helen Mirren's portrayal of her was fabulous. I had read, because I'm a Nixon guy, I had read about 73 and the intelligence failure, the turning off of the listening device. I knew the whole story, but I thought that movie was powerful presentation of Golda Meir's dilemma and of the eventual assignment of responsibility to her. Yossi, I got to ask you 2 things before we run out of time, and you've been very generous. Number 1, looking back, was Chiron correct to withdraw from Gaza? I'll put my cards on the table. I thought he was wrong at the time. I think he's right in retrospect. If you had stayed in Gaza, the moral case against Hamas would be impaired. So in retrospect, I go back to Chiron and say that was a genius move. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I think that there are 2 takeaways from October 7th. The first is, are you out of your mind? How do you withdraw from Gaza? On the other hand, the second takeaway is Chiron was right. Imagine if we were trying to create one state out of Israel and Gaza. It would be a far worse nightmare than what we're living through now.
I agree.
Sharon, and don't forget, Sharon built those settlements in Gaza. He was the father of the settlement movement. And Sharon realized it had become untenable. And I did support Sharon at the time. Michael and I actually were very vocal in our support. And in retrospect, I continue to support him.
All right, my last question, and take as long as you want on this, because I want to know an Israeli point of view. I believe Brooklyn College, where you went, is part of the City University of New York, which is consumed by anti-Semitic hate right now. I believe you've got some association with Northwestern, which is my daughter's and one of my best friends' college. It's consumed by anti-Semitism. UCLA had...
I studied journalism at Northwestern.
Oh, you are a Medill guy. All right. So tell me, what do you think is going on these campuses? Do they hate Jews, or do they hate Israel, or are they just stupid? Because a lot of these kids wouldn't even know what the Ottoman Empire was if it hit them. If you tattooed a map on their arm, they wouldn't be able to tell you what the Ottoman Empire, much less the British Mandate. They wouldn't even know what the Romans were up to in 70 AD. What do you think is going on here?
I want to circle back to something you said earlier about Israel in relation to the West. I think that some of these demonstrators hate America. And that this is really first of all, an expression of self-hatred. And yes, it focuses on Israel, it focuses on the Jews. And there's certainly precedent for that in history. You begin with the Jews, it never ends. It never ends with the Jews. And the reason that I say that what I feel is really happening much more deeply on liberal campuses today is a form of self-hatred, hatred against America, is It's because that's the atmosphere, that's the ideological atmosphere that's been cultivated on these campuses for a generation now. And certainly Israel has been delegitimized, but so has America. And so my worry about what's happening on campuses goes much deeper than the impact on Israel. I'm worried about its long-term impact on the mental health of America. The whole world depends on a strong and self-confident America, and what we see happening on the campuses is an historic implosion, and I deeply worry about the mental health of America.
Yossi, put a line under this. 9/11 was a trauma for a country that thought itself invulnerable to such traumas, despite Pearl Harbor. And the working out of that trauma is still ongoing, because it was not even a blink of an eye before we got Bush lied, people died, Code Pink, the Obama years, the Trump years, the Biden year. It's been 25 years of trauma. Do you think it's going to take Israel at least as long to get its balance back, or is its politics going to follow sort of the American unfortunate example of the past 25 years, where people have polarized to the point where they hate each other? They lose friends over politics.
Well, we were there over this last year. What always made life in Israel worth living was this shared sense that we had of living in a decent society. Yes, it was carrying this extraordinary historic story, but it was also the sense that we've created something decent where decency was not a given, not in the region and not given Jewish history. The fact that we were really able to maintain this balance between power and ethics was something that was a profound sense of national pride. And that's what began to unravel last year. And it's not politics. It's much deeper than that. What drove me out to the streets was not politics. I've never demonstrated against any Israeli government. I never felt the need for it. This was not demonstrating against the right. I would not demonstrate against the Likud government, the old Likud. This was about destroying the basis, the shared basis of what we love about this country. And we will not divide over politics. Well, of course, we are divided over politics. There are bitter debates over the future of settlements, the future of borders. Those are issues that could tear us apart, but not in the way that we were torn apart last year. Because when we lose this shared sense of purpose, of a shared sense that we're doing something here that's good, that's right. When you lose that, then you lose the basis of a commonality. And God forbid that Israel should go that route. And it makes me very worried for the future of America.
I can't let you close there. Haviv Rettig Gur always says, we're not going anywhere. We gotta confirm to our Arab neighbors and to our Palestinian friends and enemies, we are never going. We are not colonialists. We are the native peoples. And he always wants to make sure that's in there. Do you agree with him? You're not going anywhere?
No, we're not going anywhere. That's for sure. And the expression that I use about the return of the Jewish people home is that we re-indigenized ourselves in our homeland. And, that's a strange word because it doesn't exist. But this is a very strange story. There is no story like the Jewish return home. There's no story in history of a people that lost its ancient land, that kept faith with its land, that centralized its lost homeland in its national and religious identity, that believed, however improbably, that it would return home one day from 100 exiles around the world, and even more improbably, actually did return. There's no story like this. And so, no, we didn't wait 2,000 years to return to simply give up and say, well, we tried 75 years, 80 years, good try, time to pack up. That's not the way the story is going to play out. And the sooner that our neighbors realize that, and some of our neighbors are realizing, that's the astonishing breakthrough of the Abraham Accords and the possibility of peace with Saudi Arabia. We talk about peace with Saudi Arabia as if it's, Israel and the Saudis. Saudi Arabia was our most implacable enemy.
You're right to remind us.
About the Nixon era. Go back.
You are right to
Arab
remind
oil
us of that.
boycott.
Yeah.
Go back to the Arab oil boycott. The Saudis in the 1970s were our most dangerous enemy. Now the custodians of Islam's holy places are not only considering a formal peace with Israel, but normalization, which is something that we didn't have with Egypt and Jordan. And so, let's end really with I won't call it optimism, because in the Middle East it's best not to be optimistic. but hope is certainly integral to the Israeli experience, and I believe that it isn't inappropriate for Israelis to hope even after October 7th.
We will leave it there, and I'm going to adopt your word of re-indigenization, because I think that's exactly correct. Yossi Klein Halevi, author of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor and many other fine books with the Hartman Institute. Thank you for your generous dollop of time, and Godspeed.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for your friendship, and God be with you. God be with all of us.
You bet. Amen. Bye-bye.